Welcome to Bryan College Online. Today we're looking at the eschatological material in the New Testament and how we should look at that, and in particular, the date of Revelation. What we're going to look at today is how do I understand the book overall? How does my understanding relate to where I come down on date, or for any reader, the decision about date? Is the book about the temple being destroyed in 70 AD, or is it about the end of the world, or somehow is it both those things? And then we're going to look at the broader question in terms of eschatological discourse. Is the eschatological discourse in the Synoptic Gospels primarily about the destruction in 70 AD, or is it about the end of the world, or somehow is it about both those things? So, what is the main argument or arguments for the early date of Revelation? And probably the main argument, we're going to look at this in detail, is that the beginning and end of the book both has this statement: this is what must shortly take place. If the book is about the end of the world, that is primarily about the end of the world, and if nothing from chapter 4 on has happened yet, it seems very strange that the book would start and end with this is what must shortly take place. Second argument is that if the great whore is in reality the great adulteress, and if the whore is contrasting the virgin bride, well, we've seen that exact analogy in Ezekiel, where apostate Jerusalem is presented, and then Ezekiel gets this vision of the heavenly temple, and he measures that temple, and so it's kind of putting two visions of God's people, an earthly apostate view and then a heavenly faithful view. The argument for an early date is that would explain how this book was meant as encouragement to Christians who are being persecuted by Jews. After 70 AD, there was no Jewish persecution of the church, and it looks like there's evidence that the ones persecuting at least two of the churches are being called Jews. And if you take that early date, then the destruction of those rejecting Christ, what the book is saying is that you oppressors, in effect, have become the arch enemy of God, just like Sodom and Egypt and Babylon. The destruction of wormwood and feast for the birds, all those are covenant curses in Deuteronomy of people who have chosen not to remain true to God. And if that's how you read it, then the message of Revelation is the same for every persecuted group of Christians. Just hang on. The day will come when God has had enough and will destroy the persecuting body. And then lastly, many who take this early date will point out that there's a connection between Nero and the beast. So let's dive in. The beginning and end of the book. So Revelation 1:1, revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. That seems a very odd statement if the vast majority of the book has nothing to do with the immediate recipients. 1:3, blessed is one who reads, blessed are those who hear, for the time is near. Seems perfectly reasonable if it's written, say, in 68. The destruction was coming in 70. If it was written in 96, then the vast majority of these things have not yet happened. And then when we look at the end, 22:6, these are words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God of the spirits, sent what must soon take place. So it starts with this statement of what's going to happen, and it ends with this statement. Seems that would make perfect sense. If it's an early date, a little bit of a challenge if it's a later date. And then 22:10, he said, "Do not seal up the words of this prophecy, for the time of this book, for the time is near." Now, what's interesting about that is if you look at the end of Daniel, Daniel is told to seal up because it's a long way off. Very odd if this is in contrast to near, but that so you evaluate that. Look at those two passages. Second argument is that the great whore is apostate Jerusalem. Now, in the Greek text, it's the tes pornes, or if this were in the nominative, he porne, tes megales, the whore, the mega whore. So this one, it's talking about this enemy. Well, who is this mega whore? Well, it's interesting that word whore, porne, we get the word pornography from it, occurs 56 times in the Greek Bible. And when you look at where it appears, it's always talking about a whorish city, that is Jerusalem, how the faithful city has become a whore. Jeremiah 3:3, the forehead of the whore, you refuse to be ashamed. This is Jerusalem. Ezekiel 16:30, the works of a woman, whore. This is about apostate Jerusalem. And so, and we could just go through all the texts, but they're all pointing to this city that was married to God and then became a whore. So, put that in English terms, to commit adultery against someone, you have to first be married to them. And if, Babylon is Rome, many people take it as Rome. When was Rome ever married to God? But we see in the Bible that Jerusalem was married to God, and she played the whore against God. So this was the title on her forehead, the whore mother, the mother of whores. The woman you saw is tes polis, tes megale, the city, the great one that rules over the kings of the earth. You might say, well, that sounds like Rome. When you look at the whole Bible, similar things are said of Jerusalem. Second angel followed, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. To commit adultery, you have to be married to someone. The great city split into three parts. Remember, Babylon the Great gave her a cup filled with the fury of his wrath. Babylon, the great city will be thrown down. And in Greek, this phrase is always the same. He polis, he megale, the big city. But the first use of that, and these are all exactly the same uses in Greek, is 11:8. Their bodies will lie in the he polis, he megale. Of course, it's in the genitive there. So, but I'm giving you the nominative for comparison, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. Well, could it be figuratively called Babylon too? But then it spells out where also their Lord was crucified. So, He Polis, He Megale, we're told verbatim is where Jesus was crucified. And Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. So, if that's true here, is it true of all these other places as well? Apostate Jerusalem is the whore in the Old Testament, and therefore apostate Jerusalem is the mega whore in the New Testament. So the destruction that's being promised is the destruction of apostate Jerusalem. How would that encourage churches persecuted by Jews? Well, John is saying, well, just hang on, and God's going to take the persecuting body out of the way. And same thing later when Rome repeated that. The day came when God had enough. Rome was destroyed, and or when Rome stopped the persecution. And it seems like that pattern is very similar throughout history. So if you take the early date, it would be encouragement to the churches. And we can see it is a Jewish persecution. I know your tribulation, your poverty, but you're rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not. They're a synagogue of Satan. They're not a true synagogue. They're persecuting you, but they're not God's synagogue. They're Satan's synagogue. In 3:9, behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down. The idea of a Jewish persecution of the Christian church after 70 AD is unthinkable, it seems to me. But before 70 AD, the apostate Judaism did persecute the Christian church until the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Notice that all the churches that are listed, so this John is exiled on this penal colony island where he's having to serve in the mines. He's been exiled from Ephesus, and so he sends letters to these 7 churches in order, but they're all in this one province. Well, why is he doing that? Well, it's probably the guy who took the letter is making those rounds. He's following the highway there. So how is it encouragement if Revelation is just about the end of the world? How is it an encouragement to those 7 churches? If the early date is true, Jesus is saying just hang on, and God will do something about the persecution. Here we have that phrase, tes polos, tes megale, so that's a genitive. If you put it in the nominative, it would be he polis, he megale, the city, the great one, which is called figuratively Sodom and Egypt, but where their Lord was crucified. That can only be Jerusalem. So if he polis, he megale is Jerusalem, clearly here the first time, why is it he polis, he megale, Jerusalem throughout the book? And you can see the phrase he polis, he megale is exactly the same. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets. If this is talking about Rome, well, Rome didn't kill any of the prophets. In fact, the Bible says it's impossible for prophets to perish other than at Jerusalem. So is killing the prophets Rome or Jerusalem? It seems like you make a pretty good case that it's Jerusalem. Then we have this Ezekiel-like thing. I was given a measuring rod, rise, measure. Do not measure the court outside, leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, for they will trample the holy city 42 months, 3.5 years, in other words. Same time of the siege, 66 and a half up to 70 AD, makes perfect sense if this is early date. Blood of the saints and the prophets, they're drunk with the blood of the saints. The mighty angel said with such boulder is thrown into the sea, the great city, Hey Polis, Hey Megale, Babylon, will be thrown down, never to be found again. In her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints and of all who were killed on the earth. And I suppose if you take the early date, never to be found again, that is, never to be found as God's city again, God's peaceful city where the nations go to worship God. And then many will look at this idea of the beast Nero as favoring an early date. And the reason, you might have heard this, that somehow in the manuscripts these numbers 666 and 616 are both connected to the Greek and the Latin form Nero Caesar. And you might say, what in the world is that talking about? Well, many ancient cultures struggle to deal with language, to deal with numbers. And one very common way to deal with a number is called gematria. That is where you use your alphabet as your number system. Both the Greeks and the Hebrews practice gematria. In fact, I have an old concordance where all the numbers are written in gematria. So that not only is this an aleph, it's also the number 1. Beit is 2. Yod is 10. Kaf is 20, and so on. And the same thing works with Greeks. Greeks use gematria. Well, what that means is if you take the term Nero Caesar, in the two major ways it was written, you either get 666 or 616. And since the manuscripts are divided there, Bruce Metzger says what some of the scribes are doing is they're trying to fix the number. They're both assuming that it's Nero, but they're slightly changing the spelling to make it more likely agree with what they were familiar with. I'm pretty sure that this is the right number, 666, and they're just spelling out in Hebrew characters the normal way that you said Nero Caesar in Greek. If that's true, if there is some kind of gematria going on, I'll leave you to look at on your own whether there's gematria in the Bible. Many scholars are saying yes. If that's true, well, it would be connected with what's happening in the wider world when the temple was destroyed. And then lastly, the whole beast idea, if you take time to read Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars, in his chapter 6 is the chapter about Nero. It describes his life, and Nero lived a debauched life. He did unthinkable, wicked things. He persecuted Christians in Rome. But one of the things that Suetonius says is that he debased himself sexually to the extent that after exploiting every aspect of his body, he invented an erotic game whereby he was loose from a cage dressed in a wild animal's pelt. And I'm not going to read the rest of the stuff because it's pretty gross, but what it's saying is that Nero dressed up like a beast. So would it be amazing if this number of the beast was somehow connected with Nero? This calls for mind with wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains um, on which the woman was seated. Uh, Apostate Judaism looked to Rome for um, keeping law and order. Um, of course, Rome is the city of seven hills. Um, they are also seven kings, five of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. As for the beast, was and is not, is the eighth, but belongs to the seven. It goes to destruction. It's a little questionable exactly how you count, whether you count Julius Caesar as the first king or not, or you call Caesar Augustus. And there's a question, three different people vied for kingship during the time after Nero's death. Ultimately, Vespasian is the one who got it, and he left. He was the general over the siege in Jerusalem, and then his son is the one who actually burned the temple to the ground. All of those, you could argue, could favor an early date. Well, what are the best arguments for a late date? So if we've seen kind of gone through some that are early, what are the ones for late date? And the main one, and I think most people would say this, is that the overwhelming majority take the position that it's 96 AD because of a man named Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote in about 180 AD, and he says this was written in Domitian's day, and nearly everyone in the ancient church and many people in the modern church will follow Irenaeus. The argument is that emperor worship fits better in Domitian's time than in Nero's time. That argument can cut both ways because, I think it was Claudius who joked as he died, I think I'm becoming a god. That's way before Nero. There were persecutions, massive persecutions in Domitian's time, but Nero burned Christians in his garden. There is a very technical argument about the Nero come back to life myth, in that who was and is not and will be, that's somehow connected with this. It's argued that the churches are way too developed in Asia Minor to be so early of a date. When we come to this issue of date, you can see, can you not, that where you come down on the date is going to greatly affect how you interpret the book. G.K. Beale is a world-class scholar. He comes down on the late date, but he has this interesting statement. He says, Sweet's conclusion about the issue of Revelation's date reflects a balanced judgment. To sum up, the early date may be right, but the internal evidence is not sufficient to outweigh the firm traditions stemming from Irenaeus. So that's how most people come to it. They say, yes, I see how the early argument, the data might favor that, but Irenaeus is very early. It depends on, how much weight you put. Here's the quote. So it's from his book, Heresies, Book 5, Against Heresies, Book 5, Section 30, Sentence 3. The section there is Irenaeus is going over the possible names for the Antichrist. And he says, "We will not, however, incur risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist, for if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen not very so long ago, but almost in our day, toward the end of Domitian's reign." There is a little bit of question there about the translation of the quote. Irenaeus originally wrote in Greek. Most of his work is only preserved in Latin. We do have this part of the quote preserved in Greek by Eusebius, but even that, some people say it may not mean the way what it means. It may mean he was seen, that is, John. John lived to Domitian. It's a technical argument. I've seen people go both ways with it. But at the end of the day, how you date the book does affect interpretation, and you might see that the same thing as the eschatological discourse. And so when you work through and you read, kind of do two documents in your mind and say, well, what would be the evidence of one versus the other? As always, I hope the rest of your week goes very well, and look forward to talking to you next time.